But then they got another one which is like the make everyone happy plan, and another one is the fluffy bunny plan. You know how they sort of market these things, and it's $6 trillion that they're just chucking about.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was the thing, and maybe I'll refer back to it because there's some quite good quotes he comes up with. He said once he went to a conference in China. He's been calling it the Second Cold War for quite a while.
Yeah.
And Niall Ferguson is the sort of guy who likes to deliberately say provocative things, probably to help him sell books primarily, but it doesn't mean he's wrong. And he said it in China once, and he was amazed how no one pushed back.
Right.
In China, and he went up to some sort of senior Chinese sort of public intellectual and was like, "How come no one pushed back?" He went, "Because we agree with you, mate."
But did he not do it with a Cockney accent?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Because you're fucking speaking the truth, bruv.
Geezer.
Because I feel you, innit?
No, there's no need for that language.
Yes, there's no. Sorry again. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. It's a nice day out there. I've actually booked us in to the White Hart. So we went out for a drink after the pod and they were like, have you booked a table? This is the new reality now. Especially before May the 17th. May the 17th we're allowed to drink inside. Oh, lucky us.
Yeah, but you still can't walk up to the bar though, can you?
Right, so you drink inside and you still got to book a table. Yeah. And everyone's still got to be neurotic.
It's going to be even worse actually on May the 17th because everybody will go, oh, that's the next stage of the reopening. Right. Let's all go out and occupy the pub all day long.
And we know it's really stressful. I actually feel for the pub people. I mean, sometimes they get on my nerves a bit when they're telling me I've got to do this, that and the other, but I put myself in their shoes. You know, they're forced to be officious. Anyway, and then we went to White Hart, which is our local, here at the Bluefin building. And they were like, oh, have you booked a table? You know, we used to just pitch up like you do.
Yeah.
And we're like, no. You go, well, I can fit you in here for an hour. And then we got relegated, and that was a sort of covered bit with heat lamps. And then after that, we got relegated to the shitty bit around the side, and we got cold.
Yes. So we didn't last long.
So I've actually booked it this time.
Excellent.
We've got 2 hours of solid White Hartage. So that's good. And then next week I've booked the Flatiron Square. And the week after that, I've booked the Anchor. I've got serious about it.
Yeah.
Well, I just don't like getting turned away from pubs, man.
I think our listeners really like to hear about this. Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, telecoms.
Important stuff.
Well, we always talk a bit of shit at the start.
Yeah. Hey, what's your language?
Oh, yeah. Tell us, what happened? Was it on LinkedIn?
No. We're not going to give him any credit.
Oh, no? Okay, well, I'm going to say it. Someone on LinkedIn said, is there really any need for that kind of language? To which the answer is, of course, yes. There is.
It fucking is.
Next question. So, there we are. I'm
glad we've cleared that one up.
If you're going to ask silly rhetorical questions. Okay, but what are we going to talk about that isn't to do with pubs? It's not been the busiest news week. It's also been a short week, so we've only got 4 days to draw on. But I always say that journalists actually earn their money when there's fuck all happening.
Yeah.
You know, if there's a really obvious thing like, you know, Microsoft buying Apple.
So we shouldn't have been paid this week.
That's easy. No, this week we should get paid because this is the week where we've got to actually find something.
Scrape the barrel.
Yeah, exactly. we got to polish the turd. And so this week's turd polishing is going to be, there's a sort of globalization / outsourcing theme. We're going to start by talking about the enduring global chip, not ship. I actually put that as a typo that someone sort of sent me an email to correct me. I said ship shortage. I mean, there may be one of them as well because they're all stuck in the Suez Canal.
Well, they need chips, don't they, these days, probably?
Well, you need to ship chips.
Everything needs...
Global chip shortage, which is enduring and, if anything, could be getting worse. And, you know, the interesting thing about it is not necessarily an explicitly telecoms-y thing, although I'm going to refer to an article that Mike at Light Reading wrote about that. But it just affects everything. You know, and one point I made is you have a drought in Taiwan and you can't buy an iPhone in North London. You know, that's globalization for you. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about another sort of public cloud thing. Yet another telecoms company getting into bed with public cloud and basically going, can you sort our lives out for us?
Yeah.
In this case, Vodafone and Google. And then we're going to finish off talking about Italy, where they had a cunning plan to unify all the fixed line networks into one, and then the EU went, don't know about that, son. Whatever Italian for son is.
They also sound like Xi Jinping.
Pierre's more likely to know than we are.
Yeah.
It's like a Romance language, but...
You see, I'm not going to try and do like a mind your language Italian accent.
But you remember that trip in Italy with the mayor of Rome?
Yeah.
I felt like I could understand everything she was saying because it was such basic politics. And
it's because we're paying such close attention to her as well.
Yeah.
She didn't like any of our fucking mayors, that's for sure. Yes, cool. And just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site, you can also see it on YouTube and Facebook, and you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. Cool. All right. So, yeah, the chip thing. So I've got to admit, this was an example of one of those journalistic, I don't know where my second story is coming from. Mm-hmm. And I was just having a look around, having a look at my inbox, having a look at the internet, RSS, all that stuff. And I just noticed a few chippy stories, none of which necessarily rock my world by themselves, but in my mind I sort of aggregated them together into a sort of hasty narrative. And my headline was Quarterly Season Haunted by Chip Shortage. And one of the reasons I came up with that, I think two of the things that inspired me, I saw that Nintendo and Sony had recently warned, this isn't telecoms, but it's electronics, that they were going to flog fewer like Switches and PlayStations, not because of demand was low. So normally, if sales are down, it's because demand's down, but now it's because supplies, they can't actually meet demand because of the chips. And then I saw Mike from Light Reading sort of did a collation of what some other tech companies, including some telecoms companies, all US ones, I think, were saying in their quarterly earnings, and it kept coming up.
Yeah.
It probably came up because analysts were asking them rather than it was in their pre-prepared stuff. But that doesn't really, that just serves to sort of validate my narrative point, which is that this is like the elephant in the room. Everyone wants to know about this, almost no matter what sector you're in. So if I have a little look at Mike's table, who did he summarize? So he's got Apple. So he's just done a table. He's gone company and what they said. Apple, what they said, expects to lose between 3 billion and 4 billion revenues in its current quarter, which will be Q2, calendar Q2.
Just because it can't make the phones.
Yeah. And, we all know that Apple, that Tim Cook, when Tim Cook took over after Steve Jobs died, his thing was supply chain. Steve Jobs was the sort of design genius and this sort of charismatic maverick type. Tim Cook was much more prosaic.
But this is why I don't get it, because we talked about this last week. Now remember, you talked about the wafer. It all comes down to the actual base, whatever they print.
Well, you've got so few companies that make the high-end chips, yeah?
Yeah.
And a lot of it's done in, as we know, we keep talking about TSMC. Mm-hmm. I think they make 80, I think the Economies did a good piece on them, actually. It's quite similar to the thing that I wrote a few weeks ago. But but they had the figure, it's 84% of top-end chips are made by TSMC.
Well, that's ridiculous. One company.
And so they have to allocate capacity in their fabs, yeah? It's the same equipment they're using, I think, and the same space in the buildings that they're using to work on all sorts of different chips.
But you sort of get to bags capacity.
I spoke to somebody in the UK about this, actually, a guy called Andy Sellers, who works for one of the catapults. They're kind of set up to advise industry and government on key sectors, and his is the semiconductor one. And he was saying what TSMC had done is basically they'd had to make a decision about allocating capacity to automotive companies or mobile phone companies. Yeah.
But that's why I don't get it. They obviously did mobile phones.
Yeah.
So how come Apple is being hurt?
Because obviously there's only so much they can do. Everybody's now starting to feel the pinch. There's so much demand for these devices and gadgets, that they just can't keep up. They can't keep up with it. Plus, they've had some supply issues as well, actually. That's what doesn't get reported.
So that sounds like even without the pandemic, that could have been an issue as well.
The pandemic has made it worse because it's made people more heavily reliant on electronics.
Yeah, well, it's two things. Initially, I was pinning a lot of it at blaming it on the US government. And this thing that they instituted last year where they said Huawei can't get hold of any US chips. And not just US chips, but any chips or gear that's made with using US intellectual property, which is pretty much fucking everything.
Well, that's caused a lot of stockpiling. So it's made companies panic and buy lots, yeah? And then, so that's an added pressure point. But the pandemic has driven sales of electronic gadgets because people are working at home. So laptop sales, for instance, they use chips, obviously,
but
of course.
It basically screws up. So this is the broader thread or theme to me of this podcast is globalization. We've reached a point. Like for years they've had this thing called just-in-time stock keeping. Where you don't stockpile loads of stuff in a warehouse and then just dip into it. You've got everything set up with minute precision, such that you've only got the amount of stuff coming in that you need to turn into your widgets, and then get them out the door.
Yeah.
And it's all very agile and flexible, and you can tune it up and tune it down. And again, Apple under Tim Cook is one of the masters of that, apparently. And then that percolates down the supply chain. So if Apple wants sort of perfect just-in-time supply, then Foxconn has to be brilliant at perfect just-in-time supply because they're the ones that make the iPhones. They have to have a great relationship with TSMC, which is where they get the chips from. TSMC's got a good relationship with whoever, that provides the raw materials, the silicon providers, whatever. Yeah. And then as soon as one thing gets out of kilter, there's just this massive domino effect.
Yeah, and the trouble is that there's, everybody talks about, a good supply chain strategy really should be one that's diversified, to some extent, where you've got some redundancy there, and if something goes wrong with one supplier, then you can fall back on another one, which is exactly why there's a whole conversation about the radio access network's been going on.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the chips, and I never realised this until last few months when there's been attention on it and the whole Huawei thing, that how reliant we are on TSMC, and the only alternative to them, it seems, at the moment is Samsung for the state-of-the-art stuff. Even Intel's fallen behind.
So imagine if there was really if the tensions between China and Taiwan escalated even further.
Yeah,
that could be a big issue on chips.
Yes, that was the point of the thing I wrote, and it was also one of the main things in the Economists piece was that this is the reason why a war between. A war where China invades Taiwan. The reason it's such a worry is actually not necessarily to do with the geopolitics and coming to the aid of Taiwan defending an ally. It's just
got no
total
chips.
Disruption to the chips.
It
would be so bad.
It would be a brilliant way to sell it to the people. Be like, we need to go help Taiwan. No, why another war? Well, how about you don't get your new iPhone? Okay, yeah, go.
Yeah, totally.
Go now.
Well, so just like I don't know what the actual reasons were for like the Gulf Wars, but the stated reason for the first Gulf War was Iraq piling into Kuwait and safeguarding crude oil supply.
Yeah, it's very similar.
Yeah,
it's very. So
you could just look at semiconductors as equivalent to crude oil. It's just that they're a manufactured good rather than the commodity. Yeah. But it's a similar concept. There's a degree of diversification, and I bet it's accelerating rapidly. Where TSMC's got plants in
Although apparently the stuff that it's building in Arizona, and it's also building plants in China as well. So the interesting about TSMC is it's tried to play this game where it sort of plays off China and the US against one another.
Totally. If it went too pro-US.
But it doesn't want its state-of-the-art stuff done in the US. These fabs that it's building in the US, I don't think do 5 nanometer.
Right, there'll be a couple of generations behind.
A couple of generations behind. And it doesn't want them to do that, just as it doesn't want its fabs in China to be doing 5 nanometer, because all of a sudden then it makes it, it loses that kind of
being Taiwan
is all this great
being
stuff
Taiwan
in
is
Taiwan.
A mad thing to be at the moment.
Yeah.
They're right in the middle of everything.
To some people,
was it the most dangerous place on earth? I think was the headline, wasn't it? And the last edition.
Yes, it was the cover, wasn't it?
The most dangerous place on earth.
The cover of the Economies,
and it was all about chips. There was a whole feature on TSMC accompanying that story about what if China invade, because basically the signs of China becoming more aggressive and entering. There's a lot of people in the Pentagon who think that the chances of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan in the next 5 years are now quite high.
I read that.
Whereas it was, I think previously they were sort of thinking a 20, 30 year time frame. They're now thinking it could happen within the next 5 years.
So were you going to say something?
No, I'm just like, what would that look like? Jesus
it would
Christ.
look bad.
Well, most people still seem to reckon.
Most
stuff I've read seems to reckon in the cycle, in terms of hot war, China's still not up there. Just even conventional war, not even talking about nukes and stuff. They've still got a bit of ramping up to do before.
Reading this, I'm not an expert on that stuff, but reading the Economist magazine story, it didn't give that impression at all. The amount of investment they've made in warships and stuff, and the US has fallen behind. They were saying now.
Right,
The
okay, fair
tables
enough.
have
Well,
really
I've read
turned.
other perspectives.
Which is one of the reasons why the
but
US is so
they're
worried.
clearly catching up.
So they played out a
That's
series of
undeniable.
war games in the Pentagon where
Yeah.
one side took the China's position and one side took the US, and in every single war game they played, the US lost.
Well, it's funny. We've never actually seen the Chinese army in action ever. We've seen with the
No.
World Wars the other armies.
They
but never.
generally prefer to go to war with themselves. And in fact, they're a bit rubbish if you look at how they got battered by the Japanese like before the Second World War and that sort of thing. But they were a completely different country then.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, the technological sophistication of China now is ridiculous, yeah, and it's a big brother state where everybody's spied on, and they have the equivalent of the FANG companies there. They have their own bats, which are just as sophisticated. And
Yes.
you know,
Although they are currently getting slapped about by Xi Jinping.
and then look at Huawei. You know, I mean, we've gone on about them for years on this
every
podcast,
podcast.
and we've always, it's recognised now widely across the industry how sophisticated they are. Yeah, they started off with this reputation for ripping off US companies and doing low cost products. Look at them now; they're regarded as the front runner. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe not an 18-month lead as used to be said, but certainly they're up there. They're competitive. They're probably one of the best, and maybe not, if not the best.
And
in some
certainly
areas,
pound for pound in terms of what you get for your money
Yeah.
and all that sort of thing.
So
yeah.
maybe all of those UFO sightings are all Chinese aircraft.
They've just invented a UFO.
Yeah.
But why is it getting? I mean, you were saying that the signs of it getting even worse.
Okay,
Is
yeah,
that
I'll
just
get
a
back
kind
to
of
that.
increase
But there's
in
another
demand?
thing. If we remember, you were talking about The Economist. I don't know if you read The Spectator this week, but their cover story is about China. And it's Niall Ferguson, that well-known historian,
Yeah, he's good.
saying, what's going on here? We seem to be, increasingly in the West, seem to be going, if you can't beat them, join them with China in terms of command economy and top-down
Yeah.
and all that sort of thing.
Picking winners, that sort of stuff
Yeah.
that's going on in the
And
UK. at the moment.
America,
Was it
they've
specifically
announced
about the UK he was
since,
talking? Or?
Since Joe Biden came in, they have announced federal spending programs amounting to $6 trillion.
Yeah. No,
Like
he's gone crazy with
three
the
lots of
checkbook.
two. There's the stimulus for just giving everyone a couple of grand just to, which is their equivalent of like a furlough scheme. They never had a furlough scheme. So now they're like belatedly going, all right, here's a couple of grand. Now your business is already
Well, I think
fucked.
people are getting sent money who don't even live in America.
Yeah,
and
I know.
haven't lived there
There
for
was,
years. They're getting checks. And someone in the Spectator wrote about that as well.
what's
So
her name?
Check for
Forget her name.
£2,000 turned
Well,
up.
it was something.
or
The
something.
furlough thing was abused here as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no doubt. And Kate Andrews, that's it.
Yeah.
She was going, I just got 2K.
Yeah.
Lighting on
And-
fire.
But then they got another one which is like the make everyone happy plan, and another one is the fluffy bunny plan. You know how they sort of market these things, and it's $6 trillion that they're just chucking about.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was the thing, and maybe I'll refer back to it because there's some quite good quotes he comes up with. He said once he went to a conference in China. He's been calling it the Second Cold War for quite a while.
Yeah.
And Niall Ferguson is the sort of guy who likes to deliberately say provocative things, probably to help him sell books primarily, but it doesn't mean he's wrong. And he said it in China once, and he was amazed how no one pushed back
Right.
in China. And he went up to some sort of senior Chinese sort of public intellectual and was like, how come no one pushed back? He went, because we agree with you, mate.
But did he not do it
Because
with a Cockney accent?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Because you're fucking speaking the truth, bruv.
Geezer.
Because I feel you, innit?
No, there's no need for that language.
Yes, there's no sorry again. Yes, why might it get worse? So another thing I saw when I wrote this thing was Counterpoint, my former colleagues at Counterpoint, although not explicitly them writing it. Someone wrote a thing about this drought. Did you know there's a massive drought going on in Taiwan?
I knew that one of the problems for their semiconductors is not just demand, that they've had some water purification issues at the plant.
Yeah, well, in
And you
Taiwan,
need that with-
they'd be grateful for the chance to purify the fucking water in the first place.
Right.
Conspiracy theory. It's engineered by China.
There we are. They're shooting infrared from satellites to evaporate the water.
Yeah.
It also just hasn't been raining. And and they did a little table, and this is by a bloke who presumably is Taiwanese, or at least understands what's going on there in a way that I don't. And he sort of correlated reservoirs with foundries, not just TSMC, but Micron, Winbond. I'd never heard of Winbond, but they're a thing. And basically, all their reservoirs are at about between 5 and 20% of normal capacity.
Right.
That's pretty low.
Yeah.
And it hasn't started raining yet. They normally get a typhoon, so that part of the world, it just sort of wazzes it down. It's either dry. Well, I know I've been to Taiwan. It's a classic sort of subtropical humid
Monsoon.
Right. Yeah, sort of monsoony thing. So there's always moisture in the air, and then every now and then you get these sort of cataclysmic rainstorms, and that sorts the water out for a bit.
Yeah.
And they just haven't had that. So we've got a slight sort of pun there, perfect storm, in so much as we've got all the chip stuff that we've been talking about, and we've got this drought affecting all these places. And as you've rightly said, TSMC and other Taiwanese fabs account for a hell of a lot of all the chip stuff. So I think this is going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
So basically, if you're going to buy a phone, I'd get out to the shops.
Well, they were suggesting, because I listened to TSMC's last earnings call, and they were sort of saying the same thing, really, that seems like it's. I mean, they're spending a huge amount on sort of ramping up capacity, which includes these Arizona fabs and other stuff they're doing. I think the commitment's
and you can presumably
huge.
Import water. But
it's a huge commitment. It's something like $100 billion that they're saying they're investing over the next few years.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because you look at the revenues last quarter. So let's remember that since September, they've not been able to sell to Huawei, right?
Yeah.
Which used to be their second biggest customer after Apple. And you think, well, you look at what happened to Neophotonics, which was heavily reliant on Huawei and has really kind of like obviously come down a lot because it's lost that customer. I think about half its sales came from Huawei at one point.
Okay.
I mean, TSMC, obviously, it's much, much less than that, 12, 13, 14%. But you still take that out and you think this is really going to hurt, a business to lose a customer that's responsible for a double-digit percentage of sales. And their revenues were like that in the first quarter.
Yeah.
Because there's just so much demand from everybody else.
Well, and I think there was a quote, they said it's actually helped us because...
Oh, you mean it would have been even less iPhones without?
I mean, a pod or two ago, I spoke about sort of smartphone market share, and and the vacuum left by Huawei has just been filled, and it seems to have been filled by people who perhaps even more reliant on TSMC than Huawei was.
Yeah.
So they've just been like, no, we're good, keep banning.
So are like
stuff.
Big governments looking at TSMC and thinking, can we replicate this somewhere else? Not to
well,
put all our eggs in
big
the same
governments
basket?
are in discussions with TSMC. So just as the US has invited them to build this plant in Arizona, Europe is talking to. So Europe has a plan called 2030 Digital Europe, I think, or something like that, to basically try and double the amount of semiconductor production that gets done in Europe from 10% to 20% by 2030. So
and every time it involves TSMC.
Well, how do you do that? This
sounds like a monopoly.
How do you do that? Because to do it yourself, you're talking about tens of billions of dollars of euros.
They've got a sort
of
of best
investment.
practice monopoly,
and they've got best practice. So
there's like Global Foundries. I know I visited their fab in Dresden.
Yeah,
there are fabs that are not TSMC in Europe,
but they just don't
not
have the
as good.
cutting edge stuff. So you either have to try and acquire that capability yourself and spend a huge amount of money. Where does that come from?
Yeah, so they're just so far ahead. Basically.
Or you get Intel or TSMC or another foundry to do it. And the best guys in the world are TSMC. But the thing is, you're still getting it from a Taiwanese company, but it's not on the island of Taiwan.
No,
if you can persuade them to make 2 nanometer stuff or 5 nanometer stuff in Europe, then you've got some kind of semiconductor security that we don't have at the moment.
Yeah.
Because if China invades Taiwan...
That's what I'm saying. But even if you have a TSMC foundry in Germany, that might still be affected by Taiwan being...
Well, it might be, but the production's being done in Europe, I mean, they could nationalise it if need be in the case of a war.
There comes a point where there's just... just like we had... You remember we had all that hysteria over the vaccines between the EU and the UK at the start of the year. Mm-hmm. And the EU was trying to block because there was stuff being manufactured in vaccine manufacturing plants in Europe, but dedicated to send to the UK, and they were going to go, we're going to shut that down. And one of the reasons that was a really, really revealing and reckless thing for them to do is that they were threatening to set a precedent of anything that's on EU soil. As soon as we get the arsehole, we're going to just take it over. And this is getting back to this Neil Ferguson thing. That's kind of the broad point he's making in his Spectator cover piece, which is that we're starting to look dangerously like we're being seduced by a more central command model as is typified by China. And the EU, to be fair, the EU's always been that. That's why I've always been hostile to the EU. It's a corporatist thing. It's all designed to help the biggest organisations. So corporatism is a term that's been around for ages. I think it was defined initially by like the Catholic Church or something like that. But it's basically a symbiotic relationship between the state and large private enterprise, such that they help each other out, such that it almost becomes impossible to distinguish between them. If you look at like really mobilized economies, like maybe Germany during the Second World War, could you tell a massive difference between the Nazi Party and Siemens or whoever made Messerschmitts or whatever at the time? You know, it all becomes just one big thing. But it's still, just like in China now, it's still ostensibly private enterprise. It's not pure communism where everything's owned by the state. But the private enterprise exists to some degree at the good grace of the state. Yeah. And there's this symbiotic relationship. Anyway, and that's what Neil Ferguson's saying in this thing. And there's just some great quotes. He goes, there's some Chinese philosopher who talks about a single world empire, and he calls single world empire 1.0. In this sort of geek era, everything's got to be 1.0, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And single world empire 1.0 is sort of Anglo, let's say American in the 20th century. Let's say its high watermark was Vietnam, after which it went into some kind of retreat. But very slow retreat. And anyway, let me just read out a little bit. He goes, the globalization of our time, according to Zhang, which is this public intellectual, Chinese public intellectual, is the single world empire 1.0, the model of world empire established by England and the United States. But that Anglo-American empire is unraveling internally because of three great unsolvable problems. This is all quoting this guy, and you'll see a common thread. So the unsolvable problems are the ever-increasing inequality created by the liberal economy, the ineffective governance caused by political liberalism, and decadence and nihilism created by cultural liberalism. So the common thread is liberalism in all those three things. So this Chinese philosophy is too much freedom equals inefficiencies equals not being able to do things so well equals the collective being a less effective thing. Now, I don't agree with that on a couple of levels, but I can see where they're coming from. So you look at the response to the coronavirus, for example. We don't know how much to trust the data or lack of data coming out of China, but they seem to have, once they put their mind to it, they seem to have nipped it in the bud pretty well, which isn't bad for a country of 1 point however many billion people, in a way that we haven't. You know, we've got on top of it now because of vaccines, but, you know, Europe's still struggling. India's having a nightmare right now.
And it started there.
And it started in China, yeah,
even harder.
But, you know, not only were there, like, famous stories of them welding people into their houses and shit like that, but you can just imagine on a cultural, street-by-street level where you've got Communist Party members everywhere, you've got people grassing each other up for not wearing masks or whatever. It's just so much more intrinsic control. It's funny, you've got a sort of not dissimilar philosophy which permitted Sweden to have less of a formal lockdown, but there it's voluntary. Mm-hmm. The Swedes, to generalise massively, the Swedes just seem to voluntarily be quite communitarian, quite into, okay, you know, we'll do whatever's for the greater good. Yeah. I resisted my shitty Swedish accent there. Whereas in China, they're like, do you know what, we're not going to leave it to chance, we're going to make you.
Yeah.
And, you know, all this lockdown stuff, again, is quite China. Anyway, this is it's quite a tangent. It's got nothing to do with the core subject. But the interesting core thing is, I suppose, that we're increasingly faced with a sort of political, philosophical dichotomy of less liberty or more liberty. And my worry is that this pandemic has sort of set the scene for less liberty. Yeah. Because, you know, we're all like, okay, I'll wear a mask. All right, I'll wait for permission till I can go to the pub. All that sort of thing. I won't go to football games.
Yeah, heavy state involvement in different aspects of life. And this picking winners thing that's going on. This started with the whole Huawei discussion, I think. You know, the inclination of the UK, for instance, to try and have its own makers of radio network equipment, and You know, there's been articles written, I think, in the Telegraph recently saying that we've done really well as a manufacturer of vaccines. Why don't we try and become a chips powerhouse as well? You know,
exactly. It sort of set the precedent, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this guy Andy Sellers, who I brought up a couple of times, who I spoke to, you know, I was chatting to him about it, and he said, you know, it's interesting looking at what we've, you know, Britain since the 1970s, because this sort of stuff used to go on a bit in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
You know, trying to pick winners. British Leyland is an example, isn't it?
Well, and a lot of it is not coincidentally was post Second World War.
Yeah,
because again, we'd set the scene for it.
And I think Leyland was a sort of merger that went wrong, a car company merger.
And they just produced utter cack.
It was engineered by the government and it didn't work out at all.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, we've not been very good at this sort of picking winners thing.
No.
Market does that more efficiently. But then on the other hand, if you're sort of playing devil's advocate, if you don't do it, then you maybe don't have these things that are of real strategic importance, like a chips industry, and you're in this kind of exposed position. So
then you get that.
Which one do you want? You've opened one.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
go for it. Then you get in that position where, you know, is there a happy medium where you can have the state sort of benignly sort of prodding and assisting and encouraging without picking winners?
Yeah.
I mean,
there's weird stuff.
I just can't think of too many examples of where that's paid off either.
No, and there's weird stuff going on in telecoms specifically at the moment. I mean, that report that came out, you know, that Ian Livingston's little team did, the task force, which the government doesn't seem to have acted on yet. But the recommendation in that was by 2025 they should buy a quarter of their network equipment from Open RAN companies, you know, or suppliers other than Ericsson and Nokia, I think it was saying. It's like
just arbitrarily do that.
No, you know, I mean, if you said that to, I haven't sort of asked specifically operators what they think of that, but I'm pretty sure if you went and talked to anybody and said, what do you think about the government telling you that you have to meet this requirement, they'd be horrified.
Yeah. I think Vodafone would be more benign.
Well, they're almost doing it anyway.
Exactly.
But the others that aren't doing it and that have already picked their 5G roadmaps, and all of a sudden they're being told, hang on a minute. No.
I think they probably just dismiss it. They're like, go on then, make us.
Yeah.
Bring it on. You know what I mean? You're too busy worrying about getting curtains up in your house. See, Labour got a kick in those local elections.
Yeah.
Anyway, I won't go there. Okay, so steering it back, we'll sort of start to wrap this one up. I mean, so the semiconductor thing is going to be an issue for a while, and it could well start to affect telecoms directly. It could start to affect networks. You know, I mean, operators, how much direct need they have for chips is debatable, especially as operators aren't really involved in the handset game anymore. But if...
well, their network equipment needs chips.
Yeah, quite.
Yeah.
So via the vendors, it's an issue.
Yeah.
As far as the phones go, I mean, you know, I don't know about you guys. What's the longest you've had a phone on the go before you got a new one? They can last years, can't they? And still be functional.
4 or 5, yeah.
I mean, I've still got a couple of Galaxy S7s at home that I'd given to the kids that's still at a push.
Yeah,
I mean, I
could fire
refreshed
it up
last
and
year,
make
so
them
I'm
work.
not worried about that.
Yeah.
You did
we
as
can
well.
manage. It's less. I suppose it's less the risk of a blackout because we haven't got the devices anymore, because we still do and they work. It's more if these companies aren't making money and aren't able to sell, then that translates into an economic downturn. It translates into layoffs, and it's the last thing we need coming out of a shitty economic.
And there's so much of it. I just had
anyway.
every now and then get little anecdotal reminders, like just getting out of Blackfriars station to walk to the office here. There was a little souvenir thing, like with Union Jacks and Beefeaters and
Oh yeah, the corner.
models of the Tower of London, all that usual tourist tat.
Yeah.
And that's just dead. It's just
Oh
empty.
really? Wow.
Yeah, it's just game over.
As in gutted out completely.
Yeah.
Huh.
Like even down to the cliched unopened mail sitting
even
on the floor.
Oxford Circus here, which is the main high street. There's tons of shops, big brands just gone.
Just gone. I know.
Like, as in, not like it's closed. You can see concrete. Everything is completely cleared.
They're not just boarded up so that sort of Extinction Rebellion doesn't gob on them or something. So there's all these little anecdotal reminders, and
On the cheery note,
and we can just see it carrying on. And as you say, I mean, back to the globalization theme. The thing that really strikes me about it, firstly, I will say now, I'm sure the pandemic's going to represent the globalization high watermark, because we've got all this balkanization that we've been talking about for a while.
there were the tariffs as well.
Yeah, exactly. Tariffs, what you were just talking about, the security of supply. So one of the big things globalization does is it basically exports deflation. So, the reason why we outsource all our manufacturing to China is because the average Chinese factory worker gets paid a fraction of what the average English factory worker gets paid.
Yeah.
And it's actually cheaper for us to buy it from someone in China and pay for the shipping than it is to pay for some Brit to do it.
Yeah.
That is just globalization as far as I'm concerned in a nutshell.
It is, but that in itself is changing quite a lot now.
Yeah,
I think.
totally.
Yeah,
I agree.
the economics is an interesting thing with this whole sort of low cost labour markets, because as they become more middle class and wages start to rise, they lose that particular advantage, and then it moves to places like Vietnam. But eventually, these issues, this will be lost, and automation is making it a more of a sort of redundant argument anyway. I think now you have these factories.
Totally.
I mean, Ericsson's talked about this. You got a factory now in near Dallas, I think, where they've got about 100 people in it, and it makes all the equipment for North America.
One lad called Sven.
Yeah, and so with automation, you can put a factory anywhere. You can put it in North America and operate it just as economically as you can in some sort of Chinese backwater. Not that everywhere in China is a backwater.
Yes,
no,
we've been to Wuzhen. That wasn't a backwater, was it?
I read an article, I think yesterday actually, that China now pollutes as much as the rest of the world combined.
Together.
And you could read that and think, oh, so bad China. But it's really, they're making your stuff over here.
They're making your stuff, and it's also
it's exported pollution.
A big part of what seems to be Chinese philosophy on this, and I've had this confirmed chatting to people like Wei, is they feel historically it's their turn.
Yeah.
And also per capita, the pollution is still much less than the US.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, but they build lots of coal power stations. But that comes up with a lot of this green stuff. It's like the industrialized world, which now has the money and technology to go to renewables or nuclear or whatever.
I don't know why China doesn't have tons of nuclear power plants.
Yes, good question.
It seems like they
Maybe
really
they do.
should.
God knows. But then we suddenly go, right, everyone else, right, Africa, right, Latin America, right, China. Nah, we've decided pollution's bad. We've had our industrial revolution. We're ahead now. Now we've decided pollution's bad. And so from their point of view, you can see them going, well, hold on a sec.
Yeah.
It's our turn to burn a bunch of coal and
we're going to end the football game at the 70th minute.
Well, quite. We're good now. We're 1-0 up. So you can see that from their point of view, and that's all feeds into the sort of globalization thing. And I just think now, Trump started it before the pandemic with a lot of his anti-China rhetoric, but I think everyone's realizing now that we need redundancy built in. That ultimate globalization is about zero. This just-in-time and all that is about zero redundancy in the global supply chain. I want to buy a widget on Amazon now. And I've got to say, actually, this gives me a brief opportunity to plug my book, which I've now published. And I published it on Amazon. And, I'm not going to be unprofessional and bang on about Scott, but it is relevant to this because on Amazon, I was like Monday, we had Bank Holiday Monday. I'd finished my final edit. I whacked it up into the Amazon cloud. Within a couple of hours, the ebook was ready. I announced it on Facebook, another cloud, and a few people went, "Oh, can't we get hold of the physical book?" I was like, "All right." I thought everyone would just be happy reading it on a Kindle, and then I went back into my Kindle Direct Publishing account, set up the paperback. There was a bit of dicking about with the formatting, but it wasn't too much of a hassle. Got that going, and then the next day that was ready.
Wow.
And people are already buying them. You've already bought one. It just hasn't turned up yet, but people have sent me photos of ones they've arrived.
Yeah.
And so this is all between...
So efficient.
This is all like me starting it on Monday, sorting out the print book on Tuesday, and by Thursday, people have got the thing arriving in their letterbox. I mean, that is hardcore efficiency that Amazon does. And we take the piss a lot.
Yeah, and I used to work in the publishing industry. You realise how complicated that process is for a publisher to get through. And how
I'm sure the book doesn't look as good
is.
as like a proper...
It probably doesn't. I mean, there's a lot of, the type... But, you go back when I worked in publishing 20 years ago and people were still doing typesetting on... It's probably... I mean, they're still using programs like Quark Express, I think. But it's probably part automated now, I suspect. And... the fact that you can have a company just churning something out that quickly, whereas it used to be quite a painstaking process to lay all this stuff out and check it all, it's quite scary. I mean, this is we're going to come onto the cloud again, I suppose.
Yeah, we will in a sec.
But
No, I've done my bit of self-indulgence.
frightening, the impact they're having on industries.
It is,
besides
but
ours.
I've got to give them respect. I will talk about how scary, as we have on the pod, how scary it is, how big and influential and market distorting these companies are. I'll talk about how out of order it is that AWS can just shut off Parler. I'll talk about how sad it is that half the high street's gutted because people like me can't be asked to get up.
About your book, I liked your author blurb. He wrote a book in his spare time. It took him ages.
Yeah. And that was all just written at the last minute. I didn't give it much thought because it was all
that made me
queued
laugh
up.
a lot.
Oh yeah, my author blurb was Scott Wacheno is a technology journalist who wrote a book in his spare time. Full stop. It took him ages. And that was it. And it did. It took me about a decade. So Identity Crisis, Scott Wacheno, available on all good Amazon websites. Anyway, enough of that, Scott. Let's move it on then. Cloud and Vodafone and Google. Why don't you take it over?
Well, we talk about deals between cloud companies and operators all the time, and there was another big one on Monday. It was just a bit of an odd day for it to go out, I thought, on a Monday. It was a bank holiday in the UK, and the press release went round. I saw the FT had got wind of it on the Sunday and covered it then, which is a day when you've got to be really sad to read the FT on a Sunday, haven't you? But
Depends what else you
so
got
I don't know,
going on in
maybe
your life.
it was almost like they were trying to, either something went wrong with the PR there, or they were trying to not sort of make too big a deal of it. But to me, it seems like quite a significant announcement. I mean, it does build on a previous arrangement. So if you go back to late 2019, Vodafone did this agreement with Google where they wanted to move their analytics and their data management platform off this more sort of on-premises setup they had. I think they had about 600 servers and a system called Hadoop, which is sort of starting to look a bit dated, I should say.
It rings a bell.
Yeah,
it's like one of those things that I never really understood.
Right. Well, it's analytics. It's all the data basically that Vodafone generates. Reams and reams of network and customer data that they can crunch and derive insights from and information. I mean, this is the underpinnings, I suppose, of machine learning and AI in the future. And what they'd done with Google was to do something a lot more sophisticated that would take advantage of Google's expertise, use Google's cloud resources, and it was called Neuron, I think.
Yeah.
And I remember Johan Weiberg, who's the CTO of Vodafone Group at the time, he basically said, we're not good enough to do it ourselves, reading between the lines. And what they've announced on Mondays is a kind of new setup, pitched almost as a joint venture, really, but I suspect that most of the muscles come from Google.
Yeah.
Where they've created this unit called a new platform called Nucleus, which seems to build on top of Neuron. And there's also another technology they're using called Dynamo, which seems to be a sort of
quite geeky names. Aren't they?
It seems to be like a sort of data courier. It kind of moves the data around your network to where it's needed.
Oh, is that it? I mean, when I wrote it up, and I'll happily defer to you because you will have given it more thought than I did. I said the data platform is called Nucleus and the data analytics system is called Dynamo.
Well, the Dynamo moves things around, I think,
right,
and Nucleus does the sort of, the kind of, and Nucleus sits on top of Neuron if you look at the small print in the release. So it does sit on top of that. But to me, it's I mean, what they would do with this, if you look at the things they're talking about doing, are, you might have Mrs. Miggins in Chipping Sodbury who likes watching gardening programmes at 7 o'clock in the evening and has a spike in traffic then, but she's not really using services at other points in the day, and this is what her usage patterns look like, and in the future Vodafone could go, well, this is the exact sort of broadband package that would suit Mrs. Miggins, and we can tailor that and sell it to her. Or they could do things like we've got some issues going on in the north of England at the moment because there's a big event happening, and what's the impact of that going to be on network usage, and could any faults arise, and they can run all this stuff through Nucleus and basically derive insights and make investments accordingly. So
that's why I sort of characterise the whole thing as a digital transformation thing, which is a phrase that's kind of fallen out of fashion. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah,
we talk about it less, but my understanding, and it is a bit of a sort of pat, nebulous, digital transformation. What does that mean? But my understanding of it as a sort of substantial thing was, I suppose to some extent, what this is, just lobbing everything into the cloud, such that everything's digitized, everything's virtual. as little as possible is physical or geographically constrained.
Completely. So all this, exactly, with all this data that they used to have on premises sitting in different bits of Vodafone, essentially has gone into Google Cloud, and that means they get rid. So a lot of this is about cost savings, of course. They get rid of a huge amount of IT estate. I think their whole SAP systems are going into Google Cloud as part of this.
That was part of the announcement.
But it's also, digital transformation. But it's kind of, I was a bit provocative in my headline and said it's like Google taking a step closer to running Vodafone, because all the important decisions about the network, if you extrapolate this to where it could end up going, it's almost like you've got this AI system, because it will become an AI system in the future, saying this is this is where you need to invest. This is where you need to sell services that fall under this category. This is where you need to worry about faults. It's like this system's basically taking charge of network maintenance and telling the executives to make a decision about it. And it's just another instance to me of a big US cloud coming along and having a relationship with an operator that is, they're all in with it. And you come back to, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, I think, on the pod, this when we were talking about AWS and Dish, and the deal that those two companies have done. You go all in with a cloud like this, and there's no coming back from it, according to people like Snap, which is the company behind the Snapchat messaging system, was quoted in the US House of Representatives report when they were looking at market power and worrying about big tech, basically. And they were saying if we had to move from Google Cloud or Azure to another platform, it would be really costly, to move. There's design issues, there's transition is just really, really hard to make. They've gone in and trying to extricate from themselves from this kind of arrangement would be really, really, and yet they're so worried about being overly dependent on a radio access network company, and yet something to me that's much bigger and much more of a kind of a dependence.
And we should stress that we're not assuming malevolence on the part of the public cloud company.
No, of course not.
It's just the very fact of that dependence. So there was something else that's ringing a bell that I was writing about today. Oh yeah, there was the other thing I wrote about today was Samsung and Ericsson resolving their patent dispute.
Right.
And I bemoaned what a boring conclusion it was in my headline.
It was just like where everything's okay now.
Yeah, I did that thing that a journalist should never do, which is I'm writing this story and I'm telling you in advance it's boring. But I was saying that the outcome's boring. But the other thing I did was have a little go at them for it getting that far in the first place. If they could resolve it after 5 months of legal dicking about, why couldn't they resolve it at the end of last year and not even go here?
Yeah.
But the reason is because this is how companies and how the human psychology works. People are always jostling to get ahead. They're always trying to take a bit more than their fair share. That's just what people are like.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring that up is back to this thing. You could have the most benign, sort of mutually supportive relationship with one of these cloud people. But what if one day they get a new CEO, or what if one day a senior exec who's especially ambitious wants to make a name for him or herself?
Yeah.
And they decide to go, no, we were charging you 9%, it's 10% today.
Yeah.
Have you got a problem with that? Yeah. Well, tough shit.
Do you know what stuns me though is how little. I almost feel sometimes like we're the only people talking about this, on this podcast. I mean, we go on about it quite a lot because I think it's a massive issue. It's possibly the issue of our times, actually. And yet, you look at other reports. I don't want to sort of mention publications because that's an unfair thing to do, but I just kind of feel the general conversation. It always seems to be, oh, well, there's cost savings to be realised. The cloud companies are more efficient. Why would you not do a deal? There's very little about, hang on a minute, where does this put us several years from now when everybody's moved that way, which seems to be what people are assuming is going to happen. And you have three big US clouds basically underpinning Western telecom,
Yeah.
And it's just...
I was chatting to a colleague of ours about that whole AWS Parler thing.
Yeah, right.
And he initially, when I was banging on about it, didn't necessarily see it in the same way I did. But he sort of subsequently was like, okay, yeah, I see where you're coming from now. It wasn't just Parler, and it wasn't just AWS was going, well, you transgressed our terms and conditions, and people are like, well, then what the fuck do you expect?
Yeah.
My argument was always, which I'm sure I made on the pod, that how those firstly, those T's and C's are constantly moving goalposts. And secondly, how they're enforced seems to be very selective.
Yeah.
And you could get one like tech buddy like Twitter transgress, and they'll give them infinite chances to resolve the matter. Another one, you get this unilateral cutting off. Anyway, this colleague of ours was sort of going, I can see where you're coming from now.
Yeah.
And that's it, really. It just, any dependence sets up, as you were just saying, some very precarious situations in the future. And this comes back to the globalization thing, because another thing about globalization is this massive interdependence.
Yeah.
It's this division of labor, which has been around since Adam Smith and probably before, that we understand that, if I'm gonna make some Camden Pale Ale, I'm not going to personally brew the beer and make the can and design the stuff and do the transport and logistics. I'm gonna play to my strengths and get other people to do the other stuff, and that's division of labour, and that's fine, that's understood.
Yeah.
But this is more than just division of labour. This is division of just owning it seems like your whole business.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why, in a lot of ways, why they've done it, because it comes back to what Weiberg said, that and Orange's CTO made exactly the same comment actually on a webinar about 2 weeks ago, when he was getting asked about their deal with, I think it's Google. I think they've done some kind of cloud deal with Google last year that's more to do with the edge. But
it's one of three, isn't it?
Yeah. And he was someone asked him, where's the division? Where do you sort of draw the line, and what do we think about moving to the cloud, and does it worry you? And he basically said that we have to go where the technology is best, more, and we can't do what those guys do. Now, look at Google's, Alphabet's budget, I should say, for research and development. I had a look at the SEC filings. It's about $25 billion last year. And it's gone up like that over the last few years. You go back 10 years and it was so much smaller. You look at Vodafone, share price is down 40% in the last 5 years. It's selling stuff to try and pay off debt. What were they going to do? They could never, ever build Nucleus or Neuron on their own. But the problem is, they probably talk all this stuff up about, we can tailor broadband services and we can be more cost efficient and we can, realise some competitive advantage from that. But if everybody else is doing the same thing, they're not unique. Lots of operators are now starting to go this way.
Yeah. It seems like every week we're writing about one of these.
Yeah, at some point they'll lose that. Everybody's going to be on the same level playing field again, with Google, Microsoft or Amazon providing the AI or the machine learning or the data analytics.
Do you know what the business opportunity is? Set up a company that specialises in helping you move from one cloud to another.
Well, yeah.
There's an opportunity there, isn't it? We used to call that, there's different concepts that used to be like middleware companies that basically the whole point of middleware was helping one bit of software speak to another bit of software.
Yeah.
If you set up a company that was really good at helping you move from AWS to Azure to Google Cloud,
they need open interfaces,
which they don't
need
have.
Open RAN.
Yeah, there we go. And so, as you've said several times, while we're bemoaning these proprietary closed interfaces within the RAN by the likes of Ericsson and Nokia, how open. I got that impression when I was covering the Parler thing, that AWS made some sort of very little po-faced, like, well, we'll make all their data available to them, obviously.
Yeah.
But how easy it is to just go, all right, cheers AWS, and just grab like a suitcase full of your data, go out of Amazon and pop round to Microsoft. They're both in Seattle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just pop round the corner and go, look.
Well, I suppose they have to do it.
Yeah, but how easy is it?
Yeah, well, from what I looked at quite a lot of this House of Representatives report from October, the massive one. It's like hundreds of pages. There's a section on the cloud, and all the commentary in that, after they got out and talked to a lot of experts, was that it'd be very difficult to move from one system to another. And they even had Snap in there that they got and spoke to, saying, yeah, it's massive cost. It's a technical headache.
And now, but back to the theme of the previous topic we were talking about, where we're getting this corporatism, where we're getting this sort of symbiosis between big business and the state. Presumably, the likes of AWS, Azure, Google Cloud are constantly getting contracts for domestic things. I know Bezos had a hissy fit that AWS didn't win some gig or other.
Yeah.
But one of the three is getting all these. Because we're getting nationalism attached to technology now, anytime an American company wins some kind of public sector thing, they'll get their little Star Spangled Banner out and go rah rah for America.
Yeah.
And you can just see this getting more and more. I mean, at the same time, the Democrats have come in, and there's quite a lot of antitrust stuff going on. There's quite a lot of saber rattling going on. And as we've chatted about before, every now and then they'll get like Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg and stuff, and they'll have a go at them. Yeah. And Jack Dorsey will be sitting there going, yeah, sorry about that.
Stroking his beard.
Yeah, stroking his beard. Just wondering if he's going to skin up afterwards. He looks like he skins up with that beard anyway.
God, yeah.
And
he looks like he's not a soup eater.
I don't know what he looks like now.
Because
he looks like, I was watching, that comic that got turned into the film Watchmen.
Yeah.
You familiar with that?
Yeah.
And they got a character called Dr. Manhattan, the bloke who goes blue.
Never seen the film, but
Oh right, well it's actually the film's
The bloke who goes blue.
yeah.
the film's supposed to be good, yeah?
Yeah, it is. It's not
Films
bad.
are
I mean,
right,
I read the comic first, but I thought the film wasn't. Do you familiar with both?
Not the comic, but I've seen the movie.
Okay, well the comic's still better.
Yeah.
It's the source material. Anyway, but the reason I bring him up is because he's this very sort of detached, distant person. He's so clever. He's so superhuman.
Well, Rorschach.
No, this is Dr. Manhattan, the blue
Right, okay.
blue geezer.
Yeah. With his dick out.
Yeah, he just walks around with his dick out. He's so detached. He doesn't bother wearing pants.
He's almighty.
But the point is, we see it from the point of view of his just normal mortal girlfriend, and he just like can't be bothered with normal human shit anymore because he can teleport over to the surface of Mars and just sit there and have a think. And he does get the impression with people like Jack Dorsey. He's sitting there and there's these politicians going, nah, 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 and you just get the impression that he's almost not listening to them.
That reminds me of that Family Guy, early season of Family Guy, where you have Bill Gates and the Disney guy Eisner and then Warren Buffett, and they're flying over some city, and then Bill Gates or Michael Eisner goes, "Oh my God, these people are so small, they look like ants," and then Bill Gates goes, "They are ants."
Exactly. I'll tell you what though, Bill Gates is having a divorce.
Yeah, no prenup.
Yeah, well, do you remember when Bezos had a divorce and he had to cut a check for 10 zillion
And
bucks?
isn't his ex-wife spending it all on charitable
Yeah,
causes
that's
and
actually
doing
good,
doing
yeah.
something useful with it? But
I bet she's dropping a
she's probably doing all right
dollar
herself
or
as
two on
well.
having a giggle. But
Isn't Bill Gates' wife quite successful in her own right, though?
Yeah.
Well, I think so. And they got the Bill and Melinda Gates
Yeah,
Foundation,
yeah.
all this post-Microsoft philanthropic stuff that gets all the conspiracy theorists out that they're trying to put chips in five.
I mean, we've got the vaccine. I can hear him in my thoughts now.
Yeah, because there's Bill Gates. Look, I get a little electric shock every time I slag him off in my arm.
We're connected to the mothership. Yeah.
Anyway, that's tangent. Okay. I mean, obviously, I agree. It's a bit worrying, and I'm sure it will pay off in the short and mid and possibly even long term. But there's now a sword of Damocles dangling over their head that says anytime Google wants to shift the goalposts, what can they do about
it's just a kind of diminution of the telco. There's this theme where they just seem to be retreating from anything any ambitions that they had
Any
to do
techie
anything.
stuff at all.
They're asset light these days. They're selling more and more stuff. It seems
They're
spinning
just gonna
things
become a
off,
brand.
looking for other investors. They can't do things on the technology side because they don't have the R&D muscle. What are they going to end up being? I thought it was really interesting. There was a funny.
Go on, sorry.
And this is this is actually almost a segue, but there was a research note that went out from Jefferies this week where they were talking about Telecom Italia and the stuff we're going to talk about. But they talked about the business minus all the spin-offs, the TowerCos and the fibre stuff as RumpCo. But that's the main thing, yeah? Isn't that supposed to be the main thing? And they refer to it as RumpCo.
Well, I was going to say, before we go on to Telecom Italia,
Yeah, sorry.
there was another tower thing. Was it Poland you were talking about?
Well, there's Cellnex has been
and just the model
today.
that's coming out. Just remind me of what we chatted about quickly.
Well, Cellnex is like a Spanish company that's basically gone around Europe over the last few years buying any towers it possibly
mad.
can, and it now owns about 129,000 in a region that only has 500,000. So if this deal with Hutchison is finally approved, which I don't think it has been yet, and the Italian regulator have all of a sudden has gone, hang on a minute, if they buy Hutchison's towers and they've already got Iliad's, they're going to own 70% of the towers that are available.
Well,
for
that's
leasing.
a funny thing about regulators. We've spoken about it on the pod before with the US tech giants. it's like regulators are going, hold on a sec, Facebook also owns Instagram. And it's like, yeah, you waved it through 5 years ago or whatever. What's wrong with you?
And the other interesting thing about, you mentioned Poland, is that in Poland in February they bought a company from a Polish sort of broadcaster DTH kind of platform, but it has mobile assets. Obviously, they bought these towers, but they also bought all the active equipment as well. And they announced this plan to spend 600 million.
So that's the actual radios.
Yeah, and they said we're going to spend 600 million as well, now that we've got this, over the next few years on buying 5G radio equipment.
So now they're a major client of
now,
Ericsson, Nokia, all that sort of thing.
Well, they will be.
Customer.
They've now basically crossed the line from being a passive infrastructure owner to being. So what's the final destination for this company? Is it going to be the kind of cross-border European operator that other operators come? I mean, it doesn't own Spectrum. This is the thing.
But that's the thing. So we'll bring it up, but you can see the direction of travel. So let's take Vodafone, just because we happen to be talking about them.
Yeah.
So Vodafone's outsourcing its digital transformation, its analytics to Google. It's outsourcing this and that to someone else.
Towers is its towers' interest. Now, it does have a majority stake in that, but it doesn't own as much as it used to. Obviously,
but if hypothetically this Cellnex thing you just described becomes normal, so then operators don't own their IT infrastructure, they don't own their passive infrastructure, they don't own their active infrastructure.
Yeah.
So they own Spectrum, they own a brand, they own the billing relationship.
Yeah.
You can just see it getting thinner and thinner.
They don't own
and thinner.
shops anymore because nobody goes to them. So they're closing all of those down.
They don't make own branded.
So they rely on Amazon
anymore
to send their phones through the post, when they get sent out to people. They're just, and they're not even, in the future, they're not even going to employ anybody to do customer service because it'll all be done by chatbots.
Yes.
And they'll probably be run by IBM or Google or something. Yeah. So what is it? Like, at the end of the day, it just becomes a brand, like you say.
Pretty much.
It's just a brand. And
so they're basically
how compelling
MVNOs.
is the Vodafone brand? They are, but they would become MVNOs ultimately. Yeah. I mean, it's early days for this. Cellnex isn't doing that yet, and it's Poland it might be doing. Obviously, that's the implication. But if it plays out, that's where it could go. There's interest in this model in America. I mean, Mike did a really good piece, I thought, last month. Mike at Light Reading.
Mike's getting too much credit. I'm going to find a piece that he screwed up and take the piss out of it.
And he'd gone and spoken to some analysts as well as Crown Castle and Dish. Dish actually said to Mike, their main networks guy, Mark Ruan, said to Mike, we're really interested in that kind of model where we'd actually rent 5G base stations. So Dish is like all in on this kind of thing. They're in the cloud, they're doing Open RAN, and they're now talking about
their
renting
thing was
all
AWS,
their stuff.
wasn't it?
But I don't understand what what is the company then ultimately? It's just a service company. It's just a facilitator between the customer and all the technology that's run and owned by other people.
Maybe that makes sense in terms of things like margin.
Yeah, maybe it does.
But they are surrendering strategic control. Yeah, it just feels like short-term gain, long-term insecurity.
There's sort of no sort of intrinsic value there anymore, is there? They're just a sort of manager of a relationship, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Maybe there's intrinsic value when somebody manages a relationship.
But then, as we've said loads of times, and has been an enduring theme in telecoms for at least a decade, what kind of relationship is there when on my phone, nearly every bit of interaction I do circumvents EE, my operator. It's obviously all mediated by Google because I've got an Android phone. But then, I'm interacting with Facebook or I'm reading content that's got fuck all to do with EE, like Spectator or The Economist or YouTube or whatever. They just seem to be sidelining themselves more.
Yeah. If they're not looking after the network equipment anymore, and they employ a huge amount of people to do that, they don't have people in shops anymore, and they employ a huge amount of people to do that.
So they're doing a great job of cutting overhead. No one's arguing with that.
Yeah. And I don't know. You have to think about the model, but ultimately, if a lot of them go down that route, then they lose. They would eventually lose. The margin advantage goes, doesn't it? If everybody's doing the same thing, if everybody's going to go towards this, we stick everything in the cloud, we outsource everything, and we just try and be focused on handling customers and relationships really well, and we've got really juicy margins. Well, those margins will eventually start to come down. I mean,
where's your capacity for sort of massively sort of trending upwards as well? Do you really become a utility there?
Yeah.
No one's looking sort of, I don't know, whatever my water is, Thames Water, and going, oh, I think Thames Water is really going to pull a massive quarter out of the bag.
No, well, exactly. That's the thing. They become, because they're not in charge of it, all the kind of sexy stuff, you know, the video content, and we talked about this last week, didn't we? That content's not worked out very well. And that's another area they're retreating from, actually.
But then I suppose we can't blame them for giving it a go.
No,
it just failed.
They've given it a go, but these days people just want to get a broadband pipe and they want to run Amazon or Netflix or Disney over the top of it. And you know, this whole spending huge amounts of money on pushing into content and buying sports rights has been a bit of a disaster. Let's be honest with you. It's not been, you know, maybe it's going too far to say it's a disaster, but it's certainly not worked out very well for any telco that I can think of. No. And then there was a deal. One thing we haven't talked about actually on this session is the deal with Yahoo at the start of the week, the sale of those assets.
No, well, we touched on it. We anticipated it
last week. We anticipated, didn't we?
We anticipated it last week, but yes, that concluded.
Was it, and they sold it for how much? Like
$5 billion, I think.
$5 billion, and it was about half of what they paid for the stuff. It was about $9 billion.
And what have they made from that over the years? You know, what's it done?
Well, do you know what? When I covered it, my angle was I'm impressed that they've retained even $5 billion worth of fucking value in it.
Oops, didn't work.
Because. You know, I mean, what's the point of any of it? I mean, I had to give a nod, fair play to some of the credit goes to people like the hardworking hacks on TechCrunch and that sort of thing. You know, for TechCrunch, given that it's many owners away from Michael Arrington, who created it as a sort of Silicon Valley blog. Yeah. You know, there's these hardworking people who still churn out really good tech stories, and fair play to them. And God, it must be such a drag. I mean, they were sold to AOL, and then there was AOL getting into Verizon, and then Huffington Post got sold off to BuzzFeed. Just they're getting passed from pillar to post. Yeah. And anyway, so there must be some value in there for it to still be worth $5 billion. I was surprised it was even that much.
And who was it who bought it?
Private equity.
It's private equity, okay.
Yeah.
Private equity is taking over the world, yeah?
It is a bit. Yeah.
Sounds like money laundering.
Okay, we better move it on. So the last thing is, we'll keep it relatively short and sweet, especially since I put up Mary's coverage of this morning when I was in a hurry to get out here, so I didn't read it very well. Although she did a great job as ever. Nice one, Mary. Not that she listens to podcasts. She does. She's never told me. So why don't I let you go with it? Basically, there's a thing going on in Italy where they were going to have... This is about fixed network.
Yeah, so Telecom Italia... has this plan to again, it's a spin out, it's a spin off. It's another example of a company. Right. I mean, Telecom Italia has been one of Europe's worst performing operators. I think it's fair to say over the last few years. If you look at their performance during the pandemic, it's been pretty grisly. I think their revenues are down about 1/10, and I think their earnings were down about 15%.
The lockdown was brutal there.
Yeah, I mean, lockdown was brutal there, but they've just basically, you know, they would have done badly, I think, if it hadn't been for lockdown. They've lost out to Iliad, which is this very aggressive mobile company that's come along. Their fixed line business hasn't done that well, and they're not in a lot of other markets. It's only really Brazil geographically that I think they have a significant operation in. So they're very dependent on domestic revenues, and they're very indebted as well. You know, they've got I don't know what the net debt to EBITDA ratio is at the moment, but it's been up at sort of the 3 level, 2.5, 3, and it's for a company whose values come down. I think it's probably one of those that is worth less than it owes.
Oh, one of those where
a bit like Telefonica, I think, is in that position. Its debts are more than its actual market cap.
It's not ideal, is it?
Yeah. So they've basically, I mean, one of their kind of revitalization strategies is to spin off the fixed line network into this, which they've kind of already done. They've set up this entity called FiberCop, really weird name.
I know. I always thought it was FiberCorp because that would make a bit more sense.
Yeah, and they've sold a stake in that to private equity. As you do. KKR, I think, has taken about 37%. And then Fastweb, which is another operator in Italy that's owned by a Swiss company, Swisscom. Fastweb is owned by Swisscom. It's got 4% of it or something, 4.5%. And what the plan was, Luigi Gubitosi, who's the Telecom Italia CEO, spoke about this quite a lot last year, that ultimately what they'd like to do is merge FiberCop with this other company called Open Fiber, which is a government-backed
That's it.
wholesale broadband network.
Like an NBN type of thing.
Yeah, and I think its network coverage at the moment is something like 9 million properties in Italy, full fibre.
That's quite
I don't
a
know
lot.
what Telecom Italia's is because they're very, very cagey
That
about
must be like,
what their
in terms of
coverage is.
properties, that must be like a quarter or something.
I think there's about 26 million homes in Italy. 26
Yeah, I
million
wasn't
homes.
miles
So
off
it's
then.
about,
So
yeah,
more
so
like
it's
a
pretty
third.
high. And
Yeah.
it's possible that it's got higher coverage actually than Telecom Italia has of full fibre because Telecom Italia's focused more on FTTC until now. So what they do is merge these entities and have this single broadband wholesale network across Italy that they could build on and extend. And the previous government backed this scheme. They're very supportive of it. I can't remember the last Prime Minister of Italy's name. Anyone?
Oh,
He was
hold
there
on.
before Mario Draghi.
Conte?
He left Conte. He quit in February. So very
Yeah,
recent.
they're worse than like football teams when
Yeah.
it comes to
Conte left
managers.
as recently as February, and he'd obviously
Chelsea.
I could just imagine the Italian, like he's lost the dressing room.
he actually looks like a football manager as well, though, doesn't he?
Well, yes.
Yeah, but
Well, they all
he obviously supported this plan to have this single Italian broadband network, merge open fibre with Telecom Italia. Telecom Italia would they were sort of fairly insistent. I think they'd control it. They'd have a controlling stake. That was like a deal breaker for them if they couldn't get that at 51% of it. So you'd essentially have. I think what's happened this week, it seems, according to Bloomberg, and Telecom Italia is denying a lot of this, is that the European Union has gone to Mario Draghi, who's the new Prime Minister who took over in February, and said, if you do this, you're basically reintroducing a telecom monopoly, a fibre monopoly.
Which is true.
Yes. And we don't like that very much. And if you do it, you're not going to get any COVID recovery funds and you'll get a slap on the wrist and therefore you shouldn't.
That to me, plays squarely into my hostility to the EU. What the fuck has their fibre plans got to do with COVID recovery funds? This also plays back to the outsourcing too much to a third party, whether it's a political bloc or whether it's a private provider. They can suddenly make all kinds of random things conditional.
Yeah.
So, if there was like a fund of like, good Italy, you haven't let too many monopolies happen, here's your little reward, that's fine. But if they then make COVID relief and all kinds of other utterly unrelated stuff conditional, then they're basically throwing their weight around.
Yeah.
And this has been the case with Italy for a long time. When you consider that the five big economies in Europe are Germany, UK, France, Italy, Spain. And in my opinion, the whole of the European project is set up to benefit Germany and France.
Yeah.
Actually, it's set up to benefit Germany, but it needs France there as sort of cover, as legitimacy. And we got out and we can see all that's going, what is it? We're having to send warships to the fucking Channel Islands and
that's
shit right
crazy.
now. So it's all ridiculous, but then we're left with Italy, which I think is much more umbilically dependent on the EU than we ever were.
Yeah.
And I just get the impression it gets pushed around the whole time.
Yeah.
A bit like Greece did 10 years ago in the financial crisis.
And pushed around, you wonder how much these bureaucrats really understand as well, because you said it is creating a monopoly of this. I mean, first the one thing we should be clear is that this is a Bloomberg report.
Yes.
And Telecom Italia sent out this fairly convoluted statement with lots of stuff saying not all of this is true, but it wasn't an outright denial. It was a bit odd,
shit,
the wording of it.
Yeah.
So I suspect there is quite a bit of truth to it. Sticking my neck out, I think there probably is quite a bit of truth to it. But I just wonder if the bureaucrats really know what they're doing, because it is, in a way, it is creating another monopoly. But there are such things as natural monopolies that you can manage in a way,
like the rail network.
It wouldn't make sense for instance. So it's very similar. The situation.
Could have two parallel train tracks.
Yeah, it's very similar to the situation in the UK where we have OpenReach. Yeah, and the way the regulator's trying to get around this problem in the UK is to make sure that OpenReach's ducts and poles, the things that you run your fibre cables down or along, that other people can use those, and then it doesn't become, because it wouldn't make sense to go around Italy, like you said, digging extra trenches and putting other poles up, so you've got parallel poles everywhere. It just wouldn't make sense at all. So you have to try and do this in an intelligent way. So it's wrong to just come along and dismiss this plan, I think.
So we're saying it's a bid to create an OpenReach.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I guess, you could say that Telecom Italia is
It's the former state monopoly anyway.
It's the former state monopoly anyway. It's the equivalent of Openreach anyway, and it would obviously have a lot of existing ducts and poles around Italy. It's just they obviously haven't run fibre down them all the way to consumer premises at the moment. And open fibre is a parallel thing that I think has come out of an energy company, Enel, that obviously has some passive infrastructure as well that it's been using to expand full fibre networks. But, you know, I don't know what the overlap is between their separate networks, but I just think it's wrong to necessarily dismiss the idea of a single network that is a system of ducts and poles on the grounds that it's a monopoly. It's much more intricate and complicated than that in
because
telecom.
Infrastructure can be a monopoly.
Yeah, and so if the Bloomberg report's accurate and they've just come along and said no stubbornly and you're not going to get funding, then to me, it's another example of the EC just sort of sticking its nose in and not really getting things.
Which obviously plays to my prejudice.
I mean, this is really bad, we should say, for Telecom Italia. So their share price, people have obviously taken this report seriously. Their share price went down 9% at one point yesterday, and it closed down at about 6%, 5.5%, 6%. I mean, if they can't do this now, if they can't merge with Open Fibre, then you do wonder about the deal making. They spun this thing off. Presumably KKR bought in on the understanding that this was the big plan and that it was going to be a part of this, single European network. If they have to try and build a fibre network themselves, they're essentially accepting half the market, aren't they, or much higher build out costs. And Open Fibre, it seems, has quite a big footprint for full fibre networks, and all of a sudden they lose access to that. They're competing against somebody. And
as you say, if it's just a point of dogma, and we know the EU can be a bit like this, like we've chatted lots of times about how they want there to be 4 MNOs in a country for some arbitrary reason they've pulled out their arse.
Yeah.
The thing that bothers me, and again this ties back in, is have the dogma. I just wonder if they apply that dogma just as stringently everywhere.
Yeah.
There was, and there's cultural problems there. I was listening to a Joe Rogan podcast, and he was talking about Italy. He's just in a throwaway way that Joe Rogan chats, and he's like, Italy, they just want to chill. And he's comparing it to US culture, where they're quite hardworking. A typical Yank gets like 2 weeks holiday a year or something like that, and half of them don't even fucking take that.
Yeah. And
and in Southern Europe, you have long lunches, you have long holidays. Even France is shut down in August, isn't it, Pierre?
Very much.
And it's just a different vibe. And this has always been a tension within the EU. You've got like a sort of Germanic, Northern European, hardworking, pragmatic, grafting sort of Protestant thing going on.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Greeks and the Italians and the Spanish who
Catholic and Orthodox layabouts.
I know. I'd never thought that Catholic equals lazy, but they're just a bit more. Well, it's just hotter, isn't it? Apparently there's some places where they just go, it's too hot, go home.
Yeah.
Like in the middle of summer, it's just too hot.
It's like being on the beach.
Let's wrap it up.
Yeah, like most Nobel Prizes are from cold, harsh countries.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there we are, because they might as well be in the lab.
Stay inside and
There's nothing else to do.
Yeah.
Whereas sort of Giuseppe from Naples is out there going chow and chilling on the beach. And who can blame him?
Yeah.
So
Eating pizza
and other stereotypes.
I'm saying that because it was invented in Naples. I'm not being a stereotype.
That's a good point. No, that's my department. Offensive stereotypes. Okay, so yeah, I think that's a good point to wrap it up. But yes, I agree with you. Just because it's a monopoly doesn't... And I'm someone who is anti-monopoly.
Yeah.
But just because it's a monopoly by itself, when you have a natural monopoly, when it's infrastructure, like you go... Like I walk the dog in the fields around where I live, and there's the electricity pylons. There's not parallel ones.
No, it doesn't make any sense. It's not, even the trains analogy is not an accurate one, because obviously only one train can run along that track at a particular time of the day, whereas you can run 2 fibre lines down a duct. You can use the same duct for several fibre lines, and then you have wholesale competition.
Of train tracks.
But the point is that this, the way to regulate it to me is maybe not to obstruct a merger between Open Fibre and Telecom Italia, or FibreCop, or whatever it is, but to make sure it's regulated in a way where people can get access to that infrastructure.
Well, that's the key thing that I think people often overlook when they're trying to make too much of a dichotomy between state control and laissez-faire capitalism, for want of a better word, is where the free market works best is with regulators. And I've said it loads of times on the pod. It keeps coming up, but Adam Smith said that as a quote. I can't remember it verbatim, but it's something like, people of the same trade never get together, even for merriment, if not to somehow rip off the public. That's obviously not what Adam Smith said. But he's basically saying, two blokes who are bakers are not even going to get together for a pint before the conversation is going to turn to how we can increase the price of a loaf of bread.
Yep.
That's just human nature. That's why you have to have regulators.
Yep.
That's why you cannot have a pure free market. Just like you can't have pure communism or socialism, because people will take the piss. And so, yes, regulate it properly. But there's the tricky bit. I mean, because one of the problems is that regulators are always sort of behind. Like we alluded to it earlier, them all having this buyer's remorse about letting Facebook buy Instagram and stuff like that. I was listening to a podcast with a Republican senator called Josh Hawley, who's one of the more vocal trust-busting ones, and he's saying we've got to split up all these companies, and I'm not sure I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Why have we got to split up Google just because it's kicking ass? Why have we got to split up Amazon just because it's brilliant at both e-tail and public cloud?
Yeah.
They did split Standard Oil, though.
They did split, and people referred to Standard Oil and the rail monopolies and all that sort of thing. And
Well,
maybe
it's probably because that's what they've done in the past. That seems to be the way to deal with it.
And
they
it's an easy rhetorical.
They can't think of a more imaginative way to approach it. Actually,
But at the time, it was truly one company, really.
Right. Yeah.
This
They
time,
might as well just
it's
call
two.
it
it
self
was,
oil.
but it was one company in one area of the economy, whereas these guys are spanning every single sector that there is. It
True,
seems
true.
they're in our lives all the time from the moment we.
So
wake
then you have
up
the question
till-
of, can you regulate it such that you force, like the EU always tries to do with operators, can you regulate it such that you force a fourth player?
Yeah, I just
I don't
think
know how easy that
regulators
is.
to me are very, I don't want to be nasty to regulators, and I probably don't speak to regulators enough. Very few conversations actually with Ofcom.
Yeah.
A little bit of to and fro sometimes when they put something out, but they just seem to be quite unimaginative type. They don't come up with. They're often behind the curve on what's going on, because I guess the brightest sparks are actually out there innovating and doing
Exactly.
things. And they don't seem to be
They don't offer
very
solutions.
good. But they are very bright people. I know
I'm sure.
people who've gone into regulation from consulting companies. So they do have bright people and smart guys,
Well,
but they don't seem to be very good at coming up with solutions sometimes.
They're just normally a step or two behind, and part of that is not even making any comment as to the quality of person that's at a regulator. But of course you're going to be a step or two behind because you're reactive.
Yeah. And there's a legal maze, I know, as well. I mean, I think you met some regulators, didn't you, a few years ago when
we
Joe
met
used to
Ofcom.
be here. Yeah, and they were explaining their
and they're
legal
a bit like,
issues.
why are you always being such dicks about us? Which and that's, by the way, by far the best way to engage with obnoxious journalists is to take them out for a drink and explain yourself. And just because it's so easy for us to, if it's just a logo and there's no human people attached to it, for us to sort of whittle down and oversimplify our view of that organisation. So we had a good chat with them, and they made some points about what a massive ball ache a lot of this stuff is, and how they've got to jump through tons of hoops.
Yeah.
Whereas the people they're regulating don't. So fair enough. I'm not hostile to regulators, and furthermore, the point I was just making at the start of this little tangent is that the only way the free market works is with regulators.
Yeah.
An unfettered free market is always going to gravitate towards monopolies and cartels and piss taking.
Oh, I certainly believe in the need for them. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, yeah.
Cool. Should we go and see how the pub regulators are doing?
Sounds like a good plan.
Excellent. All right. Thanks a lot for watching. Make sure you join us for the next one.